Trump's rivals helped create him. They won't win without admitting it. I've always found Nikki Haley to be a dexterous politician, and when I hear her going off on Donald Trump like she did last week, you don't congratulate or give any credit to murderers, I think to myself, good for you. And immediately after that, I think, a little late, no? After all, Haley was Trump's United Nations ambassador when he stood next to Vladimir Putin and took the Russian dictator's side over that of his own intelligence agencies. She had no harsh words for him then, although she later claimed to have privately told him that it made her uncomfortable. Not so uncomfortable that she didn't stay the full term, serving up a bottomless supply of public validation. Haley might yet emerge as a serious threat to Trump's renomination. But if she doesn't, her failure to explain that 180-degree swerve could have something to do with it. By no means am I singling out Haley for scrutiny here. After Trump praised the terrorist group Hezbollah as smart and bashed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for security failures, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie said his party cannot once again nominate a fool like this to be our nominee and get him anywhere near the presidency of the United States. As someone who has followed Christie for more than a decade and interviewed him during the highs and lows, I actually think he'd make a decent president. We can argue this point some other time. But I'm not sure how we're supposed to forget that he was a crucial, early enabler of Trump back in 2016 and continued to stand by him for most of his presidency. I haven't. The way Christie likes to tell the story, he broke with Trump on election night, when it became clear that Trump would imperil our democracy. Well, okay. So the open embrace of white nationalists, on which Christie later based a book-length condemnation of Trump, wasn't enough? How about the defiant dismissiveness of a virus that killed more than 1 million Americans, and almost killed Christie, who contracted it while helping Trump prepare for debates? And where does former Vice President Mike Pence get off saying last week, with his usual self-conscious sobriety, that Trump's comments were reckless and irresponsible? This is the same man who spent 4 years extolling Trump as one of our greatest presidents and once showered him with praise 14 times during a televised cabinet meeting, which was just creepy. I should mention that Ron DeSantis is also a Trump admirer turned critic, although when I watch the Florida governor stamping his feet in debates now, I can't help thinking of the line uttered by Smithers after Homer Simpson loses his hair and shirks off the stage, "Dead man coming through." In some ways, the 2024 Republican campaign reminds me of the Democratic field in 2008, which was full of candidates, Joe Biden among them, who had voted to authorize the invasion of Iraq, only to find themselves opposing the war as presidential aspirants. At least those candidates concocted some creative rationales for why they had completely changed their minds. Not so with this year's Republicans, who seem to lack any persuasive answer for their inconstancy, and who aren't held accountable in any event. If I were a debate moderator, I'd make them go down the line explaining how it is that they could have so loyally stood by Trump in the past. And if their answer was anything other than "I made a cynical career calculation without regard for the country, and for that I'm truly sorry," I'd make them answer it again. But my larger point isn't that candidates are being expedient, that's like criticizing a bee for stinging. It's that I think their expediency might also be a big reason that none of them rival Trump in the polls, despite a chunk of Republicans harboring doubts about his ability to win. Because maybe the most consistent factor in Trump's appeal has been his contempt for phony politicians. This was Trump's argument in the debates 8 years ago, that although he might have been crass and shameless, all the other candidates were utterly without conviction. All they're doing now, these changeling Republican challengers, is proving him right. I suspect that when a lot of Republican voters see Haley and Christie and Pence slamming Trump, they see typical politicians who will say anything to get ahead, even if it means completely reversing themselves and hoping no one notices. The only solution might be to stand up and say that you were wrong to have supported Trump in the first place. Taking some responsibility for the grotesque monster you created might be the only way the townspeople are ever going to trust you to dismantle it. Trump and today's repulsive politics echo George Wallace in 1968. The presidential candidate was a harbinger of the future that became our ghastly present. He carried plastic-tipped White Owl cigars in the breast pocket of his short-sleeved white shirts, greeted individual voters "How you doin', partner," and had a campaign manager with the name Turnipseed, but a negligible campaign structure to manage. Perhaps the most astonishing grassroots uprising in U.S. history put his name on 50 states' ballots. He drew 18,000 listeners to Boston Common in Hawthorne and Emerson's New England, far from Alabama. Misery loves gloomy precedents, reassurances that there have been times when a nation's political life was as repulsive as it now is. So try Chapman University historian Luke A. Nichter's The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Nichter argues that George Wallace, with his class-based message, created a lasting movement. In 1968, North Vietnamese deaths in 3 weeks of the Tet Offensive, perhaps 50,000, almost matched U.S. deaths in 8 war years but shattered Americans' support for the war. U.S. urban chaos, however, following 2 assassinations, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in April, Robert F. Kennedy in June, displaced the war as the dominant issue. Wallace was elected Alabama governor in 1962, propelled by full-throated racism, which also characterized his test run in the 1964 Democratic presidential primaries. But by the mid-1960s, he was, Nichter says, a New Deal-inspired Southern populist, a demagogue first and a segregationist second. His antic and comic rhetoric, e.g., against briefcase-toting bureaucrats who can't park a bicycle straight, would have echoes in 2016. The major 1968 candidates were all from working-class families: Vice President Hubert Humphrey, the son of a struggling Wallace, South Dakota, pharmacist; Richard M. Nixon, the last president born in a home without electricity or running water; Wallace, son of a farmer in Hardscrabble Barber County. The working class would define 1968. Starting with Lyndon B. Johnson, 5 of 8 presidents were to come from former Confederate states. But Wallace had an epiphany from Wisconsin. In 1964, that state's governor worried that the state would be tarnished if Wallace received 100,000 votes in its primary. He received 266,984. This startled both national parties more than they would be again until 2016. Wallace launched his 1968 campaign not in Dixie but in western Pennsylvania, where Donald Trump romped in 2016 and 2020. To get Wallace on California's ballot, his supporters there each had to complete a 2-page legal form by December 31, 1967. Ohio's Secretary of State was so given to invalidating signatures, Wallace supporters had to get 100,000 more than the 433,000 required. A spontaneous combustion of popular support prevailed everywhere. Evangelist Billy Graham said he thought that presidents are divinely chosen, but he also believed that the Almighty needed his assistance in 1968. More peripatetic than consequential, Graham fawned over Johnson, who almost seems to have favored Nixon, as Graham did. Graham, however, called Wallace one of the finest orators of the 20th century. This judgment was in anticipation of evangelicals jettisoning their standards in 2016. In 1968, Nichter reports, a senior Humphrey advisor warned of blue-collar defections. The group that we have often depended upon as the backbone of the Democratic vote is leaving us by the droves. Humphrey, however, almost won with the help of a former plumber. On September 29, 1968, Gallup showed Nixon at 43%, Humphrey 28%, Wallace 21%. On October 9, Gallup showed Nixon 44, Humphrey 29, Wallace 20. George Meany was, however, head of the AFL-CIO, and 30% of private sector workers were unionized. Today, 6% are. Meany energized his coast-to-coast membership from coast to coast, and on October 24, Gallup showed Nixon 44, Humphrey 36, Wallace 15. On Election Day, Humphrey, having tardily shifted his focus from Vietnam to populism, lost the popular vote by 0.7 points. In 1948, less than 1% of Northerners supported South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat presidential candidacy. 20 years later, Nichter notes, about 8% supported Wallace, almost half of whose votes came from the North. For years after Johnson won 61% against Barry Goldwater, the Nixon-Wallace combined vote was 57%. Humphrey received 12 million votes fewer than Johnson had in 1964, although the U.S. population in 1968 was 8 million larger. Nichter believes that Wallace's 13.5% of the popular vote started a sustained movement that migrated into and eventually came to dominate the Republican Party. On Election Day 1968, Donald Trump was 22. Biden should take Dean Phillips's 2024 campaign seriously, not literally. Minnesota Representative Dean Phillips, who is expected to announce a quixotic primary challenge to President Biden on Friday, has no chance of winning his party's nomination. But Biden should not rest easy. Phillips might not be a serious candidate, but he is a serious threat. If that sounds preposterous, it's likely because primary challengers have a poor track record against incumbent presidents. Even strong ideological challenges have failed against weak incumbents, including Ronald Reagan's bid against Gerald Ford in 1976 and Ted Kennedy's against Jimmy Carter in 1980. Those who exceeded expectations, such as Pat Buchanan in 1992 against George H.W. Bush, did so because of ideological discontent among the party's base, which is not as evident among Democrats today. Biden's job approval ratings also augur an easy win. He may be stuck around 41% approval among the public at large, but his approval among Democrats remains high, averaging between 76 and 85% in recent polls. He holds a commanding lead in primary polls, leading author Marianne Williamson by a 70-9 margin in the Real Clear Politics average. So why should Biden care about Phillips? It's simple. Lots of Americans, including many Democrats, don't want the president to run again. A recent Yahoo YouGov poll shows this clearly. Only 55% of Democratic primary voters said they wanted Biden to be the Democratic nominee in 2024. 36% said they wanted someone else, while another 14% said they were not sure. Those are terrible numbers for any incumbent, especially because they come while no serious party figure is making a case against him. A recent Messenger Harris poll similarly found that 45% of Democrats don't want Biden to run again. And, according to the Economist YouGov poll, only 55% of Democrats do want Biden to run again. Democrats might be willing to vote for him, but many, if not most, would prefer not to. These numbers are even worse among independents. The Yahoo YouGov poll found only 28% of independents who lean Democratic want Biden to run again, 57% wanted someone else. Among all independents, the Economist YouGov poll found only 16% wanted Biden to run again versus 65% who wanted someone else. This should make Biden's team nervous, because in most states, these voters can participate in the Democratic contest without having to register with the party. Phillips, therefore, need only present himself as a receptacle for unease about Biden. Most voters who cast their ballots for him probably won't actually want him to win. Instead, they will use him to send a clear message to the party, anyone but Biden. The question is, how many people are willing to take that option? Biden's support was as low as 60.4% on October 11 against Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. before the latter became an independent candidate. That was true even though 50% of Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents had an unfavorable view of Kennedy and 59% had never even heard of Williamson. Phillips won't start with much name identification, but he also won't be hampered by Kennedy's history of anti-vaccine hysteria or Williamson's kooky progressive politics. Let's assume for the sake of argument that Biden's polling doesn't improve and Phillips and Williamson get around a third of the Democratic vote in the early contests. Normally, winning by 2-1 would be a landslide victory, but such numbers would be historically low for an incumbent president. President Donald Trump received at least 86% in every contest in 2020. Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton similarly won 80% or better in their re-election bids. One must go back to 1992 to find an incumbent who won state primaries with numbers as low as 2/3 of the vote. This man, George H.W. Bush, went on to lose re-election, in part thanks to a strong third-party candidate. Democratic leaders should also keep in mind that Ford and Carter lost their re-elections, despite winning the nomination. The history is clear: messy primaries forecast general election defeats. Biden is already slightly behind Trump, the GOP's presumptive nominee, in national polling. Imagine the alarm bells that will go off if he can't convincingly win his own party's primaries. The rumblings about Biden needing to step aside would grow to a roar, especially if he continues to trail Trump in the polls. Phillips is not a charismatic, ideological challenger such as Reagan, Kennedy, or Buchanan. But concerns about Biden's age and competence might make this year different. If Biden can't put Phillips away easily in the first 4 states, expect Super Tuesday to be a Donnybrook. Ron DeSantis's problem is not that Donald Trump is famous. Back in August, the guy running a super PAC backing the campaign bid of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for the 2024 Republican primary insisted that his window to overtake Donald Trump was closing, in 60 days, to be precise. That was more than 60 days ago. DeSantis, as you may be aware, has not overtaken Trump. In fairness, that was not the DeSantis team setting the deadline. Speaking in New Hampshire this week, DeSantis said of the comment that I don't think very many people think that was a very smart thing to do. But it is a useful metric specifically because it serves as a reminder that DeSantis has gained no ground since the first debate, the occasion on which the target of 60 days was set. Then DeSantis was at 15% in the 538 polling average and trailed Trump by 36 points. Now he is at 14% and down by over 40 points. But in an interview with CNN on Thursday, the Florida governor offered a new explanation for his failure to gain ground: Trump is just too darn famous. That the interview was even occurring is a mark of how the DeSantis campaign has been languishing. He and his team have long featured antagonism to the traditional press as an organizing tactic. Now scrambling for support, he has reconsidered that approach. So he sat down with network anchor Caitlin Collins, who pointedly asked why he was not faring better. She asked why his message is not resonating with voters. I think it is, the governor replied, launching into a typical explanation of how individual voters with whom he had spoken seemed to be convinced. That is what you got to do, he said. You got to show up. Donald Trump's not willing to show up. He is missing in action right now. He does not show up. When he does show up, he reads off the teleprompter for 50 minutes. And then he gets back on the plane and goes home. DeSantis told Collins that soon Trump would not be able to get away with not putting in the work. The anchor responded, well, right now, he is getting away with what you say is not putting in the work. I mean, he is leading the polls. Yes, DeSantis replied, but that is because he is the most famous person running, a 100% name ID. He is the person people know. He claimed in some early states, a lot of Trump support was soft and then offered more anecdotes about individual voters. There are 2 problems with his argument. The first is that, as Collins pointed out, there is no indication that Trump not putting in the work is actually hurting him. The second is that the argument about Trump and his name ID is wrong. That is not why he leads the polls, just as it was not why he did not lead the polls at this point in 2015. At the outset of that race, Trump was viewed very negatively by Republicans. But his rhetoric and his recitation of themes from right-wing media turned that around. He was better known, but he managed to convince Republicans to support his candidacy. So let's consider the current moment. Polling conducted by YouGov for The Economist shows that DeSantis is viewed more unfavorably than favorably by Americans overall, but favorably by about 3/4 of Republicans. More Republicans, and more Americans, do have an opinion of Trump. Those opinions are stronger. Most Republicans view Trump very favorably, while about half the country views him very unfavorably. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is included for reasons that will become clear in a moment. See the gaps between the 2 sides of the graphs above? That is the portion of survey respondents who did not have an opinion, generally because they do not know enough about the candidates. So 97% of Americans and 99% of Republicans have an opinion of Trump, but 91% of Republicans also have an opinion of DeSantis. Only 9% say they do not. McConnell, who has led the Senate Republican caucus for over 8 years, has nearly twice as many Republicans who do not have an opinion of him. In other words, Trump has a name ID advantage, but nearly every Republican also knows who DeSantis is. They just like him less than Trump. The YouGov survey of Republican primary preferences shows a similar dynamic. Trump is the choice of nearly 6 in 10 likely primary voters, with 2/3 identifying him as their first or second choice. Only 1 in 8 Republicans say DeSantis is their first pick, but just under half have him as their first or second pick. Again, this is from a pool of respondents in which almost all have an opinion of both candidates. DeSantis argues there are Republicans whose support for Trump might be soft, which is certainly fair. In national polling, conducted by PRRI, over half of Trump supporters said there was theoretically something that he could do to cause them to drop their support. What that thing is unclear. For the past 8 years, Trump has done lots of things without seeming to do much damage to himself. It is also fair to say early state voters may change their minds in the next few months. Maybe DeSantis has polling showing that Trump support is soft. Maybe they are implementing a plan to leverage that. The question then becomes, why has not it worked yet? At the time of the first debate, Trump was up 32 points in the 538 polling average in Iowa. Now he is up 42 points. Is the effort from DeSantis in the state not having an effect? Or did Trump see his name recognition go up? These are the things that flailing candidates say. They say things like we are going to turn it around, or the voters are not paying attention yet, or the only poll that matters is the one on election day. Then they usually lose or drop out. Tell you what, let's give DeSantis 60 more days and see what happens. Dean Phillips's challenge to Biden makes Democrats ask if 80 is too old. The little-known Minnesota congressman hopes to repeat history from 1968, only this time taking on the incumbent president over anxieties about age as opposed to anger about war. Half a century ago, a politician from Minnesota challenged a sitting president for the Democratic presidential nomination. His name was Eugene McCarthy, and the U.S. Senator's candidacy helped drive then-President Lyndon B. Johnson to the sidelines in 1968. Representative Dean Phillips, Democrat, Minnesota, who on Friday announced his candidacy challenging President Biden for the Democratic presidential nomination, must believe that history can be repeated. McCarthy's candidacy was fueled by anger over the Vietnam War and attracted brigades of young people who flooded New Hampshire for the first-in-the-nation primary and delivered an embarrassment there to Johnson, very nearly defeating the incumbent. Soon after, Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. Phillips is no Gene McCarthy. His candidacy is different. He has no issue, like Vietnam, to propel his campaign and, frankly, no real beef with Biden's leadership. He says he loves the president. He applauds Biden's performance and supports his legislative achievements. What he wants is for Biden to step aside now, for a younger generation. His candidacy is built on perceived anxiety about Biden's age. The little-known Phillips, 54, elected to Congress in 2018, is a placeholder for the unease about Biden, 80, that exists among many Democrats. Phillips wants Democrats, even voters who like and respect the president, to use him to send a message that Biden should not seek a second term. The risk is that he weakens Biden rather than strengthens the Democratic Party heading into 2024. Phillips is open about his concerns that Biden might not be the strongest Democrat to go into a general election contest against former President Donald Trump, 77, or against a younger and fresher candidate, should the Republican primaries produce a surprise. Other Democrats share those fears, but not so openly. The overwhelming percentage of them probably would support Biden in a general election against Trump, but how many younger voters or Black and Hispanic men might stay home or even slide to Trump? It's far too early to know that. Biden remains the almost certain nominee for the Democrats, and yet there are other stirrings that indicate nervousness within the party about what the coming months could bring. California Governor Gavin Newsom is putting himself in a position to run, should something happen to Biden. He recently met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. He is to debate Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican, on Fox News. Senator Joe Manchin III, Democrat West Virginia, flirts with no labels and a third-party candidacy. How strong is Biden at this point? In late October 2019, a Washington Post ABC News poll showed Biden leading Trump by 56% to 39% among registered voters. That was a high point for Biden in Post ABC polls, although throughout 2020, Biden never trailed. His lead was generally outside the margin of error, and only once was the contest a statistical dead heat. The average of polls compiled in 2020 by 538.com always showed Biden leading Trump. Those 2020 polls were flawed, as the American Association for Public Opinion Research concluded in a post-election review that examined thousands of national and state polls. They overstated the margin between Biden and Trump by 3.9 points in the national popular vote and 4.3 percentage points in state polls. So the 2020 contest was closer all along than some of those polling margins suggested. Biden won the popular vote handily. The Electoral College turned on fewer than 44,000 votes in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Today's national polls show a different contest for 2024. Biden is by most measures in a toss-up race with Trump, a candidate who has lied repeatedly about what happened in 2020 and who is facing 91 felony counts in 4 jurisdictions, including 2 cases directly focused on his efforts to overturn the 2020 results. For whatever reasons, be it that the polls are more accurately stating Trump's support or that voters have their own qualms about the president, Biden appears to be in a battle that looks more challenging than in 2020, despite Trump's obvious weaknesses. But the election is still a year away in a rapidly changing world. National polls measure popular vote sentiment, not the contest for votes in the Electoral College. Biden should win the popular vote, as he did in 2020 and as every Democratic nominee has done from 2008 forward. But in the handful of truly contested states where the 2024 election will be decided, small shifts among voters can make significant differences in the outcome, as 2020 showed. The Biden re-election campaign has thrown millions of dollars into television ads, as have allies of the president, touting his accomplishments. Those ads haven't moved the numbers. My colleagues Michael Scherer and Tyler Pager reported that the president has been frustrated about what's happening or not happening in battleground states, although his advisors told the 2 reporters that they are satisfied with the initial round of ads. Biden's overall approval ratings have not moved in a positive direction. In the latest measurement by Gallup, his approval matched a previous low point in those surveys, with 37% of Americans saying they approve of his job performance and 59% disapproving. Among Democrats, Biden's approval dropped 11 percentage points since September and stands at 75%. The interviewing took place during the current month, at a time when Democrats have aired internal differences over the conflict between Israel and Hamas and over Israeli-Palestinian issues more broadly. Those divisions within the Democratic coalition threaten to become more acute if the Israeli offensive against Hamas results in major civilian casualties in Gaza. While support for Israel remains strong, support for the right-wing government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not. Approval ratings mean less today than they once did, as the 2022 midterm elections showed. Biden's approval was net negative and inflation was a major concern of voters. Yet Republicans were not able to capitalize to the extent they had expected. They won the House by a narrow margin and have been dealing with the consequences ever since, as the election of Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, after weeks of chaos showed. In 2022, Republicans also failed to win control of the Senate, missing several clear opportunities with flawed candidates. Biden and the Democrats mobilized voters around abortion rights and Republican extremism. Johnson is among the most conservative members of Congress. He is strongly opposed to abortion and gay rights, and he helped lead the effort to block certification of the 2020 election results. Closely allied with Trump, he keeps those issues at the forefront of the 2024 election. The former president remains a threat to democracy and is in clear legal jeopardy. The current makeup and positions of the Republican Party provide the counter-argument to those, like Phillips, who fear that nervousness about Biden's capacity to lead the country into his mid-80s would be a serious election handicap. That is the playbook for 2024 as well. Special elections this year have been good for Democrats, indicating that the issues that animated their voters in 2022 remain powerful motivators. Some Democratic strategists see quiet confidence within their party, because of the state of the Republican Party, rather than nervousness about the president, which they see as isolated rather than widespread. Phillips will not be going head-to-head with Biden in New Hampshire early next year. New Hampshire will be in violation of Democratic Party rules, which set South Carolina as the first primary, although New Hampshire state law requires it to go first. In compliance with those rules and a nomination calendar that Biden largely dictated, the president will not be on the ballot in New Hampshire. But the Phillips candidacy will draw additional attention to the issue of Biden's age and questions about when a generational transition for the Democrats will take place. 77 days until Iowa, and we identify the 2024 Republican runner-up. Three loosely connected things are happening at once. Donald Trump is facing a number of threats to his freedom and business, from scores of criminal charges at the state and federal level to the ongoing fraud trial in New York that has already led to a determination that he had misrepresented the value of his assets. He's also leaning into extreme rhetoric against those involved in the above efforts and against his political opponents. Trump has offered policy proposals, formally and informally, that expand on some of his most controversial policies, pulling them more to the fringe. And, in poll after poll, he retains a huge lead in the 2024 Republican primary, relegating the interesting developments to the race's second tier. Were it not for those ongoing legal fights, the effects of which seem hard to predict, and probably for Trump's own surprise overperformance in 2016, any reasonable observer would look at the 2024 nominating fight and declare it over. On Monday morning, the Des Moines Register and NBC News released a new poll of likely caucus participants in Iowa. It measured an interesting development. Former United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley has pulled even with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in the state. It's another demonstration of the way that DeSantis's once formidable position as the primary threat to Trump has evaporated, something that happened not dramatically but, instead, slowly and visibly and with lots of cringing for anyone paying attention. In the August iteration of the poll, conducted by top Iowa pollster Selzer and Company, Haley was at 6%. In the new data, she's jumped to 16%, tying DeSantis. And for every Iowa caucuses goer who plans to vote for DeSantis or Haley, more than 2 plan to vote for Donald Trump. Which is how things have been for a while. 3 of the first 4 states to vote in the Republican primary are Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. And, in each state, Trump has a lead of about 30 points in 538's average of polls. In all 3 states, and nationally, that lead has stayed fairly steady since late summer. The Iowa numbers above don't yet include the new poll, but it doesn't matter that much. The August poll showed Trump in a similar lead. Since that survey, pollster J. and Selzer told the Register, Trump hasn't lost ground. If anything, she explained, he's showing improvement. For example, 3 in 10 likely caucus goers say they're extremely enthusiastic about the candidate they prefer. Among Trump supporters, about half do. For example, 41% of respondents say they definitely won't change their minds before the caucus. Among Trump supporters, 63% say they won't. It's worth noting that DeSantis's argument for months now has been that Trump's support is soft, offering the Florida governor an opportunity. But DeSantis's support didn't change significantly since August while Haley surged, and only 3 in 10 DeSantis supporters say they won't change their minds. This undercard scrap for second place is the interesting part of the 2024 primary fight at this point. Haley has passed DeSantis in New Hampshire and South Carolina polling already, less surprisingly in the latter state, where she served as governor. Now she's caught up with him in Iowa, according to Selzer. As of Monday, there are 77 days until the Iowa caucuses on January 15. 77 days before the 2016 caucus, 538's polling average had the eventual winner, Senator Ted Cruz, Republican, Texas, in 4th place. But he was only 15 points behind the then frontrunner, Ben Carson. Carson endorsed Trump's 2024 bid this weekend. DeSantis trails by more than twice as much. The theory driving second-tier candidates, which is to say, everyone not named Trump, is that some combination of things will happen. There will be an exogenous event that damages Trump, like a new legal development or maybe even a conviction. Trump will underperform in Iowa, revealing him as vulnerable and heightening Republican concerns about the 2024 general election. Support will consolidate around someone else as an alternative, with each candidate arguing to themselves and their donors why it will naturally be them. Maybe. Or maybe Trump's lead will continue and he'll be the nominee and the jostling for second place will be as important to historians as are the names of the place and show horses running against Secretariat. The 2024 Republican field winnows, just as you'd expect. Mike Pence was never going to win the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. If space aliens arrived on Earth the day before the Iowa caucuses and kidnapped every single declared candidate except the former vice president, he would still probably have come in second, with just about any other Republican in the country edging him out after launching a campaign at midnight. It's not just that Pence was unpopular with Republicans, though he was. It's also that his political identity is intertwined with Donald Trump's, first as the former president's sycophantic enabler and then as the guy unfairly maligned as the proximate cause of Trump's removal from office. Pence announced his candidacy in June anyway. And, very predictably, he announced his withdrawal from the race this weekend. He lasted 145 days. This is about what you'd expect of a candidate who didn't make it to Iowa. Since 2000, Republicans in contested primary contests who have left the race before Iowa dropped out about 91 days before the caucuses after campaigns lasting about 160 days. Pence left about 80 days before the caucuses. To date, about a third of the original 2024 Republican field has dropped out. That, too, is normal. Since 2000, an average of one-third of the GOP field in a contested primary doesn't make it to Iowa. Their campaigns were, on average, about 130 days long. That's relatively short. Candidates who didn't make it to Iowa since 2000 generally have had campaigns that lasted about 160 days. You may be somewhat bewildered by this announcement that already a third or only a third of the GOP field has already bowed out. It depends, of course, on whom you count as a Republican candidate. Technically, there are more than 270 Republicans who've filed to seek the GOP nomination. Some subset of those candidates are considered at least putatively viable, using benchmarks that are often nebulous and fungible. Maybe you don't consider North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum a viable candidate, maybe you do think that Candy Cahoon is. There's some subjectivity to it, admittedly. I mean, as stipulated at the outset, Pence was never going to win the nomination. So why include him in the mix in the first place? It's a debate for another day. For now, we simply observe that the Republican field is narrowing as we'd expect, with candidates who have no shot at the nomination running out of cash and running out of options. That it's happening now, to this percentage of the original field, is very much in line with the past several nominating cycles. That it happened to Pence is very much in line with what any rational observer would have expected. How Trump critics hope to use the 14th Amendment to kick him off ballots. Courts around the country are beginning to consider challenges to former President Donald Trump's ability to run for office again. Here's a look at how they are playing out. What's the legal argument for keeping Trump off the ballot under the 14th Amendment? The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, includes a provision meant to keep those who sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War from serving in office. Specifically, Section 3 states if someone took an oath to support the Constitution and then participated in an insurrection, he or she cannot hold certain offices. Trump's opponents have seized on that part of the Constitution with lawsuits that contend he cannot run again because of his efforts to overturn the 2020 election and his role in the January 6, 2021, attack on the U.S. Capitol. Where are the cases happening? Lawsuits are being filed across the country, and the initial attention is on ones in Colorado and Minnesota because they are moving the fastest. A judge in Denver started a 5-day hearing on Monday, and the Minnesota Supreme Court is expected to hold arguments later this week. The Colorado judge is expected to rule by mid-November. The Minnesota court is required to issue a ruling as soon as possible under state law but could send the case to a lower court judge to develop a fuller record before issuing a final decision. Who is involved? The legal theory that Trump cannot run is backed by an unusual mix of conservatives and liberals. Voters are bringing lawsuits with the assistance of watchdog groups like Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington and Free Speech for People. In most cases, the suits are being filed against election officials because they are the ones responsible for deciding who appears on ballots. Election officials in many cases have tried to stay out of the fray and asked courts to decide the matter without taking a stance on whether Trump can run. Trump and branches of the Republican Party have intervened in some of the cases. What is the timeline? The lawsuits must move quickly because election season is approaching, with Iowa's caucuses scheduled for January 15. Many courts may rule after then, but the cases become more politically complicated as more caucuses and primaries are held through the spring. The Republican National Convention begins July 15, and all sides hope to have the issue resolved well before then. What happens after the initial rulings? The Minnesota case started in the state Supreme Court, and the cases in other states are expected to eventually get to their high courts. Rulings by state Supreme Courts can be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court can take cases if it wants, but is not required to do so. Will the U.S. Supreme Court get involved? Legal scholars say the U.S. Supreme Court is unlikely to take up cases if the states let Trump remain on the ballot. The High Court will almost certainly get involved if any state prevents Trump from getting on the ballot, they say. Has this issue come up before? Section 3 has gotten little consideration since the era just after the Civil War, until recently. Last year, Section 3 lawsuits against Representatives Madison Cawthorn, Republican, North Carolina, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican, Georgia, failed to keep them off the ballot. Cawthorn went on to lose his primary. Greene continues to serve in Congress. But a judge in New Mexico last year removed a county commissioner from office after the official was found guilty of a misdemeanor for trespassing on the Capitol grounds on January 6. The state judge determined Couey Griffin, an Otero County commissioner and the founder of Cowboys for Trump, could no longer serve in his position as a county official because he had violated Section 3. It was the first such ruling since 1869, according to those who brought the lawsuit. What are the arguments against Trump? Courts will be scrutinizing the words and history of Section 3, which in full states, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States, or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath, as a member of Congress, or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. To kick Trump off the ballot, those bringing the lawsuits need to prove Trump meets every aspect of the section. That gives Trump and his backers many arguments against the legal theory. Some of them are below. Section 3 prevents some people from holding office, but does it prevent them from running? Section 3 does not say anything about running for office, and Trump supporters argue election officials and judges can't prevent him from getting his name on the ballot. If he wins, it will be up to Congress to confirm he can serve, they say. Does Section 3 apply to the presidency? Section 3 says it applies to senators, representatives, presidential electors, state offices, and federal offices under the United States, the last one being the only one that possibly applies to the presidency. Trump's backers argue those offices are for military officers and postmasters, not presidents. Those bringing the lawsuits say the presidency is clearly an office under the United States. Did January 6 amount to an insurrection? Trump's opponents say Trump cannot serve in office because he fostered an insurrection, failed to put it down quickly and cheered on the Capitol rioters. Trump's backers say the attack on the Capitol was not an insurrection, noting he has not been criminally charged with insurrection and was acquitted by the Senate after he was impeached by the House for inciting an insurrection. They argue that even if it was an insurrection, it was not one Trump engaged in because he wasn't at the Capitol at the time. Should Congress decide the issue instead of judges? Trump's supporters say Congress is the body that should determine who is fit to be president, not judges. They note Section 3 gives Congress the ability, with a 2/3 vote, to find an insurrectionist eligible for the presidency. Courts can't block Trump from running because Congress could vote in the future to stipulate that he can serve, they argue. Can Section 3 be applied on its own? Trump's supporters say Section 3 is not self-executing, meaning it cannot be used unless there is a federal law implementing it that spells out how and when it is applies. There is no such law, so there is no way to deploy the section, they argue. Trump's critics say Section 3 is clear and can be used either on its own terms or through state laws that give election officials and courts the power to determine who can be on a ballot. High Court struggles on whether officials may block social media critics. The Supreme Court will decide several cases this term that impact the future of free speech on social media platforms. The Supreme Court on Tuesday struggled to agree on how to determine when public officials can block critics from their private social media accounts, reviewing 2 cases that will have broad implications for citizen interactions with politicians online. All 9 justices seemed to acknowledge the challenge and importance of defining when government employees are acting in an official capacity online, and therefore bound by First Amendment restrictions on censorship, and when they are acting as private citizens, with their own individual free speech rights. But there was no clear consensus on the answer after 3 hours of oral argument. The pair of cases before the justices presented a fresh opportunity for them to consider when public officials, in this case, 2 school board members in California and a city manager in Michigan, can bar critical voices from social media accounts that are increasingly used at all levels of government to communicate with citizens. They are part of a set of legal controversies. The justices will review this term that will clarify the future of speech on social media platforms. The discussion on the bench did not break down along the usual ideological lines, but the court's 3 liberal justices voiced the strongest concerns about ensuring citizens have access to public officials and critical community information online. Justice Elena Kagan emphasized the increasing role of social media in elections and government operations. This is the forum for officials to talk to citizens, for citizens to talk to officials, for citizens to talk to each other, and it is becoming increasingly so, she said, adding that whatever rules the court writes for the future have to account for the big picture of how much is going to be happening in this forum and how much citizens will be foreclosed from participating in our democracy if they can be too easily blocked from various sites. The Biden administration backed the government officials in both cases, saying they had the right to block users from their private accounts, which they categorized as a type of private property, because they were not acting in an official capacity. Assistant Solicitor General Sopan Joshi said blocking certain users from private accounts is no different than elected officials choosing to speak only to a private room full of Republicans, or Democrats, to get their views about government policies. I understand you can think of a lot of odious behavior by government officials being discriminatory in whom they speak to and whom they listen to, but, at the end of the day, the Constitution does not prohibit even odious behavior by private citizens, Joshi said. Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. and Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. pushed back on the government's suggestion that virtual social media accounts are comparable to an official's private physical property, where a politician, for instance, could hold a fundraiser or private discussion with like-minded constituents without violating the First Amendment. It doesn't cost anything to open a Facebook page, Alito said. To make so much turn on who owns the Facebook page seems quite artificial. Roberts also asked, in what sense is this really private property? It's just the gathering of the protons, or whatever they are, he said, drawing laughter from the courtroom. Should I be concerned about the fact that we have this old concept applied to what we always say is some new phenomenon? In the first case, Christopher and Kimberly Garnier, a Southern California couple who regularly posted critical messages on the Facebook pages of 2 school board members, were blocked from those pages, and then filed a lawsuit. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit sided with the Garniers in a broad ruling that said the decision of the school board members to block the couple could be considered a government action, because of the appearance and content of the school board members' Facebook pages. The board members, Michelle O'Connor Ratcliffe and T.J. Zane, regularly posted about school board meetings, surveys related to school district policy, the budget and public safety issues. Zane's page included a photo of a Poway Unified School District sign. O'Connor Ratcliffe labeled herself a government official on her page and provided a link to her school system email address. Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh pressed the attorney for the school board members about whether an official is acting in a government capacity when announcing rules, for instance, about parking during snowstorms or a town recycling schedule if the information is only available on the official's personal account, not the official government site. Local officials around the country need guidance, said Kavanaugh, whose wife is a town manager in Maryland. Hashim M. Mupan, an attorney for the board members, emphasized that government officials have the right to speak in their personal capacity about their jobs. The Garniers, according to the school board members, had spammed their accounts with repetitive, lengthy comments, leaving the same comment on multiple posts. Mupan said public officials can talk to their neighbors at church about government business or address campaign rallies without engaging in official government action. So too, he added, they can decide how to operate their private online accounts. Individuals who hold public office are still private citizens, he said. When acting in their personal capacity, they retain their First Amendment rights to decide who can participate in a community discussion that they host at their own property. The lengthy argument provided some insight into how the justices themselves use and think about social media. Justice Clarence Thomas declared himself not a Facebook person. Justice Sonia Sotomayor seemed very familiar with developments on the platform X, formerly known as Twitter, noting that it can block access, not just commenting privileges, to an account. In the second case, a different appeals court reached the opposite conclusion about when people can be blocked, based on a narrower test for evaluating the social media activity of elected officials. James Freed, the city manager of Port Huron, Michigan, was sued after he blocked a constituent's critical comments in response to a Facebook post about the city's coronavirus pandemic policies. Kevin Lindke said Freed violated the First Amendment when he deleted Lindke's comments and blocked his account. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, however, sided with Freed, who described himself on his Facebook page as a father, husband, and city manager, and listed the city's website and general email as his contact information. Although Freed posted about city affairs, the overall content on the page he created before his appointment as city manager tended toward family activities, according to court filings. The Sixth Circuit held that a public official's social media activity is only state action when the employee is carrying out his or her official duties or acting under the government's authority. Throughout both arguments on Tuesday, the justices wrestled with how to define duty and authority. Several asked whether the terms include the customary expectations of government officials that are not specifically listed in law. This is all a question of how broadly do we define authority or duty, said Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who earlier suggested the question becomes more difficult when evaluating the actions of elected officials at the highest levels of government. For a governor or, President Trump, it's a harder call than someone like a police officer, who's a subordinate, she said. Or, my law clerk could just start posting things and say this is the official business of the Barrett chambers, right? And that wouldn't be okay, she added, with emphasis, to laughter from the courtroom. The High Court in 2021 did not take up a case in which a lower court had ruled that President Donald Trump could not block critics from his feed on Twitter. After Trump lost re-election, and Twitter canceled his account, the Supreme Court vacated the appeals court decision, saying the matter was moot. Pamela S. Carlin, co-director of Stanford Law School's Supreme Court Litigation Clinic and the attorney for the California couple, told the justices on Tuesday that the test should be to ask whether an official is doing his or her job. That prompted Alito to ask whether the local mayor at the grocery store is doing his job if he listens to supporters while he shops but tells a constituent with opposing views to call the office during normal business hours. An official pushing a shopping cart is clearly off-duty, Carlin responded. But maintaining a social media forum, in which people can comment and talk to one another about public business, she said, amounts to state action, subject to First Amendment constraints. Carlin acknowledged the free speech interests on both sides of the cases, but warned the court of devastating consequences for the public if they are denied access to the sites on which their officials are talking to them and asking for their reactions. The cases are O'Connor-Ratcliffe v. Garnier and Lindke v. Freed. Democrats plan to subpoena wealthy benefactors of Supreme Court justices. Senate Democrats announced plans Monday to vote to subpoena a pair of wealthy conservatives and a judicial activist who have underwritten or organized lavish travel for some Supreme Court justices, a move that adds to the pressure on the High Court to strengthen its ethics policies. Senate Judiciary Committee leaders said they would vote as soon as November 9 to authorize subpoenas for information from Texas billionaire Harlan Crow, a close friend and benefactor of Justice Clarence Thomas, and from Leonard Leo, the conservative judicial activist. Senate Democrats do not need the vote of any Republican on the committee to authorize the subpoenas. No separate vote by the full Senate is necessary. Democratic lawmakers are seeking detailed information about the full extent of Crow's gifts to Thomas. News reports about the justice's failure over many years to report private jet travel, real estate deals and other gifts from Crow have prompted calls for the court to strengthen its ethics rules and for greater transparency about the justice's potential conflicts and recusal decisions. By accepting these lavish, undisclosed gifts, the justices have enabled their wealthy benefactors and other individuals with business before the court to gain private access to the justices while preventing public scrutiny of this conduct, Judiciary Committee Chairman Richard J. Durbin, Democrat, Illinois, and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat, Rhode Island, said in the joint announcement. It is imperative that we understand the full extent of how people with interests before the court are able to use undisclosed gifts to gain private access to the justices. Senate Democrats have backed legislation that would impose disclosure rules on the court that are as strict as those that apply to members of the House and the Senate. Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. has suggested the court would act on its own as an independent branch of government to demonstrate to the public that it adheres to the highest standards of conduct. 3 other justices, Elena Kagan, Brett M. Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, have publicly stated in recent months that the court should or would adopt a formal ethics policy. In May, Senate committee leaders asked Crow for an itemized list of gifts he has made to Thomas that are worth more than $415, which is the maximum value allowed for gifts to federal judges, including the justices, that are not disclosed. The lawmakers also sought a full accounting of the lodging and transportation Crow has provided to the justice and his wife, Virginia Ginny Thomas. In response, Crow's attorney sent a letter saying the committee had not identified a valid legislative purpose for its investigation and did not have the power to probe his personal friendship with the justice. Through negotiations, Crow subsequently offered to provide the committee with responses to a subset of its requests, and only for the past 5 years, which the senators called inadequate. Crow has said he never tried to influence Thomas's decision-making on the court. Thomas has said he thought he did not need to disclose the free trips from a personal friend. In a statement Monday, Crow's office said he offered the committee extensive information despite the serious constitutional and privacy concerns presented to the committee, which were ignored and remain unaddressed. Crow's office asserted that the committee has already passed the legislation for which lawmakers say they need the requested information. It's clear this is nothing more than a stunt aimed at undermining a sitting Supreme Court justice for ideological and political purposes, Crow's office said. Leo struck a defiant tone in a statement Monday night, saying he would not bow to the vile and disgusting liberal McCarthyism that seeks to destroy the Supreme Court simply because it follows the Constitution rather than their political agenda. The committee said Monday that it would also vote to issue a subpoena to conservative donor Robin Arkley too. ProPublica reported that Arkley provided Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. with a free fishing trip to Alaska in 2008 that was organized by Leo. Alito has defended his decision not to disclose the trip in his annual financial report. Federal ethics law requires top officials from all branches of government, including Supreme Court justices, to file annual disclosures listing investments, gifts, and outside income. The justices are facing intense pressure from Democratic lawmakers and transparency advocates because they do not have an ethics policy that applies specifically to the 9 justices. The Chief Justice could fix this problem today and adopt a binding code of conduct, Durbin and Whitehouse added in their statement. As long as he refuses to act, the Judiciary Committee will. Separately, the Senate Finance Committee released a report last week after an investigation into a loan Thomas received from a friend to buy a luxury Prevost marathon motor coach in 1999, a transaction that was first reported by the New York Times. The committee's Democratic staff said in the report that Thomas made some interest payments on the $267,230 loan, but that it was declared settled by his friend, Anthony Welters, in 2008 without Thomas repaying a substantial portion, or perhaps any, of the principal. Judge reimposes restrictions on Trump's speech in January 6 case. A federal judge has reimposed a gag order on former President Donald Trump's public statements in advance of his trial on charges of conspiring to subvert the results of the 2020 election. The restrictions that U.S. District Judge Tanya S. Chutkan put back in place Sunday evening were ones she had lifted 9 days earlier to give Trump and U.S. prosecutors more time to argue whether the gag was unconstitutional, as attorneys for the former president had claimed. Trump can now ask a higher court for an emergency stay pending appeal, but in the meantime he is bound by Chutkan's limits. The First Amendment rights of participants in criminal proceedings must yield, when necessary, to the orderly administration of justice, Chutkan wrote Sunday, adding that Trump offered nothing that made his appeal seem likely to succeed. She said Trump simply fails to acknowledge evidence that his public statements are often followed by harassment and threats against the people he singles out. Under the order, Trump and all interested parties in the case are barred from making or directing others to make public statements that target individual attorneys, witnesses, any reasonably foreseeable witness, or court staff involved in the case or the substance of their testimony. Trump said those limits were unconstitutionally vague, a position supported by the American Civil Liberties Union. Chutkan said Trump's own actions indicated he understood where the line was. While the order was on hold, Trump posted a comment on social media calling special counsel Jack Smith deranged and saying former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows would be a lying coward if he testified for the prosecution. Both comments involved some of the exact type of language Chutkan deemed out of bounds. During the week the gag was in place, he used less specific language to call the trial and the Biden administration corrupt, which is allowed under the order. But Trump appeared to potentially violate Chutkan's order 75 minutes after she gave notice that it was reinstated, attacking his former Attorney General, William P. Barr, a potential witness. "I called Bill Barr dumb, weak, slow-moving, lethargic, gutless, and lazy, a rhino who couldn't do the job," Trump said in part of an 88-word post on his social media platform that both belittled the man he chose to serve as the nation's top law enforcement officer and exaggerated his crowd sizes. "So now this moron says about me, to get even, his verbal skills are limited. Well, that's one I haven't heard before. Tell that to the biggest political crowds in the history of politics, by far. Bill Barr is a loser." About 19 minutes after his post about Barr, Trump complained on social media, "The corrupt Biden administration just took away my First Amendment right to free speech." In other cases, violators of gag orders have gone to jail, but the logistics and political implications of imprisoning a former president and current presidential candidate make that unlikely. Trump is personally furious about the gag order, advisors told the Washington Post, but his campaign sees it as a political asset. Any punishment would likewise feed into Trump's narrative that he is a victim of government persecution. In New York, the judge overseeing Trump's civil fraud trial has fined the ex-president $15,000 for repeated comments attacking a court clerk. Trump's lawyers maintain that any court-imposed limits are unconstitutional suppressions of core political speech because his re-election campaign is inextricably intertwined with this prosecution and his defense. Moreover, they say, his 100 million social media followers have a right to hear his point of view. Chutkan rejected that argument in her rulings, saying he could criticize the prosecution as political and unfounded without personal attacks that could intimidate people involved in the case and mislead the public. Chutkan herself received a death threat from a Trump supporter after being attacked online by Trump, prosecutors pointed out in support of the gag order. A Trump supporter went to the home of former President Barack Obama after Trump tweeted the address. Trump's public criticism of Mike Pence on January 6, 2021, was concerning enough that Secret Service agents protecting the vice president were notified. "Mr. Trump is a criminal defendant," Chutkan said during a court hearing on the gag order. First Amendment freedoms do not allow him to launch a pretrial smear campaign against participating government staff, their families, and foreseeable witnesses. She singled out Pence, saying Trump could make statements criticizing the campaign platforms or policies of his current political rivals without getting into expected testimony. Pence had made his decision not to help overturn the election results on January 6 part of his campaign, but he dropped out of the race this weekend. A spokesperson for Trump did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Isaac Arnsdorf contributed to this report.